Hello everyone, welcome to episode 6 in the stories of Abram. Here we take a paragraph or two a day to stay fresh with our Hebrew. So whether you're between semesters or you're a recent grad or you've been away from your Hebrew for a little bit and you're trying to recover it, feel free to pause the video whenever we start to analyze a form, see if you can analyze it first, and then restart the video in order to hear me explain it. Today we're starting chapter 16 of the book of Genesis. Let's remember what our context is. In chapter 15, we had a covenant restatement or a covenant renewal. And the focus there of the three different promises in the covenant, land, seed, and blessing, was on seed. Abram was discouraged about not having an heir, and God made this great promise to him. He takes him outside. He shows him the stars. He says, "Count the stars if you are able. Thus will your descendants be." But if you're Sarah, still called Sarai at this point, you're being reminded every month that not only do you not have a baby, you are not pregnant. And in her case, she might very well be in or has gone through menopause. So this is a really tough thing to grapple with. So we start our story with Sarai Eshet Avram Lo Yalada Lo. Now, I highlighted Sarai there because before we get into the translation, I just wanted to remind us all about paragraph structure in Hebrew. We've seen a lot of paragraphs in the last few chapters, starting with Vayihi. It's a very common way to start, but let's just kind of do a reminder. So here are some of the ways to start a paragraph in Hebrew. Yes, we can use Vayihi. We can also use a temporal infinitive construct. Often that's in conjunction with Vayihi. We can have a noun first or a non-verb first construction. So we might have a perfect verb in there, a nominal clause, maybe even a participle. We can start a paragraph by having a new time, a new place, a new person in the story, or a combination of those, even if we have a preterite, right? Even if it's a vayiktal form. And another thing we can do to start a paragraph is to have an explicit or restated subject, somebody that we already know is there, and we might think, why not just use the pronoun? But instead, we actually use the noun again. This is called over-encoding. There's more than one use for over-encoding in telling a story, but this is one of them. So for chapter 16, I just pulled out the first lines of all the different paragraphs, and so we can see this element of the explicit or restated subject. In verse 1, Sarai Eshet Avram, Sarah, the wife of Abram. Verse 3, again, Sarai Eshet Avram. Verse 5, Sarai El Avram. And then in verse 6, Avram El Sarai. In the next four paragraphs, we have Malak Adonai repeated explicitly in each case. And for these three here in a row, 9, 10, and 11, there's not a response back. I mean, you see it says, Vayomer La, he said to her. There's not a response back. And so it's not like three different parts of one speech that he gave. It's three different speech acts, and they're separated both by restating the verb vayomer, but also in this case, the explicit restatement of the subject. In verse 13, we don't have the subject of the verb restated, but we do have a new topic introduced with Shem Adonai. And then in verse 15, we have the subject restated. So in none of the cases is Vayihi used as the technique to start the paragraph in this chapter. So it's just a good opportunity for us to sit back and kind of review what the techniques are and see this one being emphasized here in particular. Okay, so let's get back to the story. Sarai, the wife of Abram, lo yalada lo. Let's take a look at yalada. Kamete on the end, that's a feminine singular ending. The yod is not a prefix, it's a root letter. The root is yalad. So we have a perfect and it is a fientive, and we're giving setting information. So how should we translate a perfect fientive in this case? Yeah, we would use a perfect in English. Sarai, Abram's wife, had not had a child or had not borne him a child. Because the non-action in this case, since it's negated, is something in the past that is giving us the current or present to the story, the current result, which is that there is no child. V'la shifcha mitzrit. So we look at v'la, and there's a mapik in the hay, so that's our third feminine singular pronominal suffix. And lamed here is belonging to her, related to her. was a shifcha. So this would be a female servant. And then we see mitzrit. So mitzrit hasn't been a vocabulary word in most first-year grammars, but we should recognize Mitzrayim. It means Egypt. Mitzrayim, that word can also refer to Egyptians generally. But this ending of chirik yod or chirik yod tav in this case is called a gentilic. So if we want to say something like the Hittite, the Perizzite, the Girgashite, the mosquito bite, that's a way in Hebrew to indicate that a person from that place or in that group. So she had an Egyptian servant, Ushama Hagar, whose name was Hagar. When you look at Ushama, you might be saying to yourself, well, the accent's down there on the end, ma, and I know that this comes from shame, and so why don't I have pretonic open long vowel under the shin? And because, that's what we would expect. But this is one of those little short words that do funny things, right? So just like ach and av and ben, short words that are pretty common, and they have some variations from the standard. So we are just always going to see that vocal shava there under the shin when we've got a pronominal suffix on shame. Okay, then we have Vatomer Sarai El Avram. So Vatomer is pretty straightforward, but do you remember why this is a cal? Because normally we're thinking like yiktol, and this is tomer. Right, there's about 5 first aleph verbs that make this change to the prefix vowel, and so we get that cholam there. It's not a hofal, and we learn vayomer really early on, and so hopefully knowing vayomer and having this common word will remind us when we come to other first aleph verbs that take that cholam, and they are also cal. So Sarai said to Abram, Hinei na. So hine is our attention-getting word, so we could do something like look here. Na is a polite word, so look here, please. Now look here. If we did now look here, we'd want to be careful about our tone of voice, because we don't want to have this insistent now look here, because na is a particle of politeness. And so she's going to bring up something that she wants him to think about. So we can say something perhaps like, please consider. And then, and I know there's no verb there in the Hebrew, and I gave it its own line, but it sort of functions very much like a clause because it's setting everything up. We could have put it on the same line. That would be fine. So Atzarani Adonai Miledet. When we look at Atzarani, what do we see at the end? We see ni, and that is not a perfect verb ending. That's a pronominal suffix, and ni comes from the pronoun ani, and so that's the 1cs pronominal suffix. And then we have our verb. We just see the root there. We have a shava under the first radical because the accent has been pulled down by the pronominal suffix, but that's a cal perfect third masculine singular form. Atzar is not a common word, but it means to prevent, to keep back, something like that. So the Lord has prevented me, miledet. What do we have with miledet? Well, we see that tav at the end. Sometimes tav is a feminine thing. And at the front, we see mem and a chirik and a dagesh and a lamed. And that's the preposition min. So we have min, our prepositions can only go on participles and infinitives. And so this is a case of it being on an infinitive. And what types of roots take a tav at the end that is not part of the 3 root letters? Yeah, first yod verbs and first nun verbs. They will drop the first radical. They will add tav at the end in order to make their infinitive. So the root here is yalad, just like we saw in the first line. So the Lord has prevented me from bearing a child, from having children. So she has an idea about how to redress this issue. Bona el shifchati. So let's look at bo, and it looks very much like its lexical form. I mean, the form we learn is bo with a vav in the middle, a cholam vav, but that's just a mater. So this really is that same form. And so it looks a lot like an infinitive construct, but it's not. How do we know? How would we recognize if it's an infinitive construct for sure? And then what tips us the other direction? The infinitive construct would either have a preposition in front of it, or it would have a time word. And this does not. Plus, it's indirect speech, and it's used with na. So this is the imperative. The imperative 2ms form looks just like the infinitive construct form for most roots. And that's what we have here as well. Bona, please go to shifchati. Please go to my maid. Ulai ibaneh mimena. Ulai, perhaps. Let's look at ibaneh. We've got no ending. We have an aleph prefix. And then we have chirik under the prefix, dagesh forte in R1, and kamates underneath of the first radical. That is a nifal. So we have a nifal imperfect 1CS form from the root bana. And we'll translate those lines something like, please approach my servant, perhaps, right, this would be a result, I will obtain a child from her. But let's talk about how the Hebrew is working here. When we have bo, please approach my servant, now this is a case of metonymy, where part of the act stands for another part of the act, or we would say synecdoche is a particular kind of metonymy where a part stands for the whole. So it's like a euphemism in Hebrew. It's not being explicit about what she's asking, and it would be really hard to think of a woman, even when she's so desperate to come to her husband and ask him to do such a thing. We don't really expect her to say all that explicitly what she wants, because it's quite likely something that you don't want to think too hard about asking your husband to do. Okay, so then she says, ulai ibaneh memena, so perhaps I will, and we parse that out, it's a nifal of bana. Perhaps there's a chance that we should compare this to a use of the cognate in Akkadian. The Akkadian cognate is banu, which also means to build or to rebuild. Sometimes it means to create. That was the only meaning that was mentioned in the dictionary article on bana for the Akkadian term. But on rare occasions, it can also mean to have a child. So, for example, when Gilgamesh is talking about Enkidu in the Gilgamesh epic, he says that your father fathered you, using this term bana. So maybe it's a metaphorical use of the idea of build, but we also know that son and daughter are built on the root letters bet and nun. So maybe there's something else going on there with the root bana, or another root bana that's related to having children. We don't have nearly enough data to tell that, but we can tell from the context, what she means, whether it's I will be built from her, or we want to get away from the metaphor, perhaps I will attain a child from her. And then we have Vayishma Avram L'Kol Sarai. Vayishma, he listened, Avram, the subject. L'Kol, kol is noise, sound. Here, since somebody has just spoken, the voice of Sarai. So let's think about Shema. That can either mean to hear or to obey. Those are the most common glosses we learn in first year Hebrew. But here it's certainly more than he heard the words that she said. And he is going to do the request. So we might translate he obeyed, but we could also pick something in the middle that indicates that he has listened to what she said and she's going to do it. So he's accepted it, right? Because hinei na, here, I'm going to put out this idea, and then he gets on board with it. So we could represent that a few ways in English. Abram listened to, or he accepted Sarah's, we could say opinion or view, because at that point, Sarah's voice doesn't sound very good, or Sarah's noise would sound even worse. And again, this is a case of using one thing to represent another, using a reference to her voice to refer to what she said. And in this case, what she said was a suggestion, or her viewpoint on something. So there'd be a whole bunch of different ways to say that in English that would be completely accurate. So Genesis chapter 16, we're in for a wild ride. The social customs are quite unlike things that we are used to, but not surprising is going to be the kind of tension that can come as a result of this.